Welcome to the Resilient Earth podcast, where we talk with speakers from the United States and around the world about the critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. From the tiniest of actions to the grandest of gestures, so that we can continue to thrive and survive for generations to come. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with co-hosts and co-producers Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendocino Whale and Seal Study, located on the South Mendocino and North Sonoma coasts. The music for this podcast is by Eric Alleman, an international composer, pianist, and writer living in the Sea Ridge. Discover more of his music, animations, ballet, stage, and film work at ericalleman.com. You can find Resilient Earth on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, SoundCloud, and wherever you find your podcasts. This week on Resilient Earth Radio and Podcast, you'll be hearing a speaker from the 6th Annual Ocean Life Symposium that was broadcast on public radio and shown live on YouTube back in October of 2024. Seastorm Studios and Planet Centric Media teamed up again with Mendocino Whale and Seal Study to produce this annual event about the health and future of our oceans and the marine life that lives within them. Coming up next, right here on Resilient Earth Radio and Podcast. Josh is a marine biologist specializing in the ecology of marine mammals, and he has spent over a decade studying the ecology of killer whales. Josh's work started in British Columbia, where he focused on the transient or Bigg's killer whale hunting ecotype. He also collaborated with researchers studying killer whales in Australia, South Africa, Washington, Alaska, and California. And Josh obtained a BS in marine biology at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, and taught ocean sciences at the Banfield Marine Sciences Life Studies in Monterey Bay, California, and where he focuses on studying toothed cetaceans. He is at the Marine Mammal Research Unit at British Columbia, the University of British Columbia. He's the Ecology, Behavior, and Habitat Use of Transient Killer Whales in the California Current. Boy, Josh, that's quite the title. Welcome to the Ocean Life Symposium. Thank you for joining us today. Josh, why don't we just find out what you're going to be presenting today while they get settled?
Yeah, so today I'm going to present some actually exciting new work that we've been focusing on. It's a big, large-scale study of transient killer whales, basically between southern British Columbia and southern California. So it shows the distribution of what we believe to be at least two populations, probably three populations. We conducted it's been about a 5-year study through the UBC's Marine Mammal Research Unit. We've kind of put together this pretty amazing database of transient killer whales throughout that area.
All right. Well, we are going to give you the platform, and I don't know, is Scott's audio on now?
I think it is, yes.
I just want to make Scott, you're with us. Are you there?
Yeah, yes. I want to be sure to congratulate Josh on the PhD.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic.
So,
thank you very much.
We need to be calling you Dr. Josh.
Dr. Josh.
Josh is just terrific.
Congratulations, Josh.
All right. Well, we're going to let our audience know that we're going to be taking a back seat here now. We're going to allow Josh to now do his presentation, and we'll be back after he is finished.
Okay. So I'll start off with saying thank you very much, the Mendocino, for letting me come and do a presentation today on some pretty exciting research on transient killer whales. So this presentation today is called the Ecology, Behavior, and Habitat Use of Transient Killer Whales in the California Current System. My research, I'm a research scientist with the University of British Columbia, as well as the Marine Mammal Research Unit, which is within the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. For some reason it's not letting me change. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So first off, I just kind of want to go over what the population status of transient killer whales looks like throughout the North Pacific. So transient killer whales are mammal hunting specialists. They're one of three ecotypes. So you have the resident killer whales, which eat fish. You have transient killer whales, which eat marine mammals, and you have a third ecotype, which we call the offshores, which appear to be primarily fish specialists as well, but they kind of feed higher up on the trophic level. But transient killer whales are found throughout the North Pacific, from as far south as Southern California to as far north as the Bering Sea up to the Chukchi Sea, but also as far west along the Aleutian Islands over to the Russian far east coast of Kamchatka Peninsula, and even into the waters of Japan. But within this range, this distribution, we have a number of populations, one in stocks. So the difference being is the population is a genetically distinct group of the whales that socialize with each other, intermingle, and share a particular habitat. And where we have stocks in the U.S., where you have animals that are managed as a particular group based on a number of features. So, for instance, this one stock we have here is called the Gulf of Alaska. We also know them as the Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, Bering Sea stock. They're found throughout the Aleutian Islands up into the Bering Sea, around Kodiak Islands into Prince William Sound, and then even as far south as northern British Columbia. And their population from a recent assessment from NOAA, based on photo identification, is roughly around 500 animals. We also have another population called the AT1s, which is this little blue dot up here in Prince William Sound in the Kenya Fjords. Their population currently is depleted, and there's only around 7 animals that have been identified as of 2020. And that population, when first identified, was in 1984 during field studies by Stephen Leatherwood, where they were looking at killer whale populations throughout Southeast Alaska and Southern Alaska. And there was 22 animals initially identified. But then during the Exxon Valdez oil spill in the late 1980s, that decreased to 12 animals and now subsequently 7 animals. But the best known stock or population is the West Coast transients. And this purple area here is the distribution of West Coast transients. So you can see throughout Southeast Alaska, all the way down to northern British Columbia, around Haida, Hawaii, BC, all the way down to Vancouver Island and Puget Sound, Washington, and then also all the way down to Southern California is the stock or population. But we also have what we believe to be an outer coast group. And this group has been recognized for a couple of decades now, but it's based on rare sightings of transients in offshore waters or further from shore, sometimes up into the Salish Sea. They kind of make appearances and then disappear. And a lot of the research that's been done over the years has kind of been back and forth about where this group really belongs, or if the West Coast population includes all whales from British Columbia to Southern California, or is it just whales from Washington, British Columbia, and really where do the animals off of Washington, Oregon, and California fit in? So my research today is kind of going to talk about what these two populations, where the West Coast transient killer whale population really fits in. I spent the last 5 years kind of really diving into the data, trying to discern if they're one population or separate. And yeah, so let's get going. So first, though, most research, as you can see here in this red circle, has been conducted in Haida, Hawaii, BC, British Columbia, in Washington State, very much in coastal waters. And that's pretty much the majority of the studies that have been produced since the 1970s. But there's been a bit of an interesting gray area, which is right here. You can see there's been few studies in this large distribution from southern British Columbia down to Southern California. There's a big gap in our understanding of the habitat use and where where these animals go and where really do they fit in. So first off, West Coast transient killer whales are actually a part of the transient population, as I mentioned. They're a subspecies, Orsinosauria rectopenis. They're apex predators that feed in coastal and offshore ecosystems. So they're found both in coastal waters and in deeper off waters along the continental shelf and further from shore. They're very important to ecosystems. They provide top-down control and food webs. Their prey includes pinnipeds, cetaceans, seabirds, and squids. So pinnipeds being seals and sea lions, cetaceans being dolphins, porpoises, and large whales. But they're also known to take seabirds and squid as well. Oh, just go back one. The West Coast population, though, initially, so the reason for this research, were designated special concern in 1999 by the Canadian government, Department of Fisheries and Oceans in COSWIC, which is the Committee on the Endangered Species and Wildlife in 1999. And then in 2001, they were reassessed as threatened. But they weren't legally listed until 2003 under SARA, which is the Species at Risk Act in Canada. And in the U.S., under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, they were listed as non-threatened and not depleted. So that's kind of the government policy. But because in Canada that they've been recognized as threatened, how plans set out. So the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada that manages marine mammals, they set out to create a recovery plan in 2007. And in that recovery plan, they highlighted that there was a lack of information on transient killer whales, particularly in south of Washington, and that any individuals part of California or Oregon should not be part of this West Coast population until more information was found. And similarly, though, NOAA came along as National Marine Fisheries Service and also said they recognize it continually as one stock or one population throughout southern BC or throughout Southeast Alaska to Southern California, but more information was needed to really kind of address this. So my overview for my research really was to better understand the population, social structure, and ecological role of transient killer whales in the California current system. We use social and geospatial analyses of photo-identified whales from southern BC to Southern California. We looked at habitat use patterns to inform management and conservation policies. This was a major part of this research. And also looking at the behavioral ecology and habitat use in whales that were primarily seen in open ocean environments where there was very little effort. So the California current system, really, what is this? Well, it's a transboundary current that goes between Canada and the US. So southern British Columbia is kind of the northern region. And then it flows south as part of this North Pacific gyre, which is a system of currents. So it connects in the northern region via the Alaska current. So you can kind of see here, this is the range of the California current. So further outside this map would actually be kind of other currents, part of this North Pacific gyre. They go out to the central Pacific, and it's just kind of this big gyre of movement of water. But for the purposes of this research, we kind of looked at this area here off southern BC, off southern Vancouver Island, as this current flows south. But the California current really is actually a system of currents. It's a mixture. So you have a main California current, which you can see here, that flows south. It's a cold water current that transports nutrient-rich water. It's primarily a surface current, a system of surface currents that extend to approximately 500-meter depth, but up to 1,000 kilometers offshore. You also have a cool coastal jet, though, that kind of flows south as well, but along the continental shelf break and north. It flows north along the continental shelf break and along the slope. But during the winter time, we also have a Davidson current, which is a warm water current that flows north. That's warm. This is primarily in the fall and winter. And this system of currents here really provides a lot of the nutrients and is part of this upwelling events that happen off the coast of California up to southern BC that makes this region such a rich and productive area. So how this study was conducted, basically what we looked at, the data collection and analysis. Well, one, field research was conducted. So we looked at data collected from NOAA research ship surveys. We looked at small vessel surveys. We looked at opportunistic sightings. And then our analysis involved looking at the population structure through photo identification of individual whales, social network analysis, which I'll go into these, And then we also looked at a geospatial analysis, and we chose three primary parameters to really kind of distinguish how different groups of transient killer whales or individuals use particular environments. And this was looking at pretty much the distance to shore, which was in kilometers, distance to the continental shelf break, which I'll explain again in a second where that shelf break is, and then also water depth. So here's kind of what the effort looks like. So where surveys were conducted. And the continental shelf break is this black line here. It's kind of hard to see here. I apologize, but it kind of runs along the shore. The continental shelf break is typically the 200-meter isobath where the continental shelf dips to the slope and then goes into the open ocean. And that's kind of this light blue coloration is this continental shelf. And the break really is interesting because the continental shelf narrows as you head south from southern British Columbia to southern California, and can range from anywhere around 50 kilometers off the coast of Vancouver Island to approximately within 12 kilometers, even to within a kilometer off the central coast of California and southern California. But you can see these red lines. These are transects. So these are dedicated surveys where research ships follow a particular route along these surveys, counting different marine mammals, identifying them. And this effort then is used to look at stock abundances of different species. And then also you can see in the green here, this green area is small vessel surveys. So we worked with our research group off of Southern Vancouver Island at UBC, also the Macaw Fisheries Management Unit, to really kind of try to fill in the gaps of this outer coast area of Washington, which is not surveyed regularly. So the social network analysis. So how this was conducted, one, we looked at individual whales. So you can see here, this is a transient killer whale. She has unique scars and markings. And you can see we also can identify them by their eye patches or the postocular patch. And each animal is unique. And this research was spearheaded by Michael Bigg and Ken Balcom in the 1970s. And you can see here where the notches on the fin are kind of a distinctive feature that stay with that animal for its life. It can change slightly, or an animal can acquire new markings, but primarily we catalog these whales and we're able to compare them to the different databases to kind of come up with population estimates or minimum counts of individuals. The next step, though, is to run this data. So each group of whales that we encounter are associating with each other for some reason. They're there, they're socializing. Each animal is socializing with every other animal. So within a population, you have, say, whale A associating with whale B. And if whale B is associating with whale C, whale A is associating with whale C based on the association through whale B. I apologize, it's a bit confusing, but all three animals are known to associate. So we used the half-weight index. We ran this through a program called SOCPROG, which was developed by Hale Whitehead at Dalhousie University for social network analyses, looking at the social behavior of animals, where X here is identified as the number of transient killer whale groups. Y of A is the number of transient killer whale groups for whale A was identified, but not whale B. And Y of B is the number of transient groups where whale B was identified, but not whale A. And through this, you get an index that can range anywhere between 0, where there's no association between individuals, to 1, where there's always association. So that could be, say, a mother and offspring. And this ranges, but it can fluctuate in a decimal point. It could be 0, 0.5, 0.6, 0.65. And it really kind of tells us a little bit about what the social structure looks like. So after running this, we kind of found this. This is kind of a quick snapshot of the raw data, looking at associations of over 500 different individuals. And this is kind of what this pattern for the West Coast population kind of looks like. So results from this, we found that transient killers were encountered 5,456 times from 2005 to 2021. Of this, 2,232 had geospatial locations, so latitudes and longitudes, and had photographs to identify all individuals present in the group. The rest of that data was then discarded and not used at least in the social network analysis. And from this, you can see the effort here. This is the effort based on the surveys where over 49,000 kilometers of effort from NOAA research ship surveys were conducted, up to 556 kilometers from the coast. Over 2,000 kilometers of survey were conducted from small vessel work. You can kind of see the highlight here. So this is relative effort based on a lot of the research that we were conducting. So results from photo identification, what did we find? A total of 159,844 photographs were analyzed. We identified 13,152 individual identifications of different whales. But from that, a total of 556 different whales were identified, comprising 117 matrilineal groups, which are a mother and her offspring, 46 roving males, 19 single or post-reproductive females. And this is kind of what we found. This is the social network from the West Coast population of individuals, in each individual being had to be seen greater than 3 times. And you can see here the yellow being what we believe to be this inner coast subpopulation that primarily occurs in coastal waters. And then we also have an outer coast in red here, which primarily occur further offshore. And there is a connection between them. So there is some socialization, which matches some of the studies that have shown genetics that are very similar throughout California, Oregon, British Columbia, Washington, Southeast Alaska, where killer whales share this kind of genetic haplotype that's very similar. But when you look at this spatially, this kind of where we found the real interesting thing. Now we've got these 2 subpopulations of West Coast transients, but through the geospatial analyses, which were based on 11,000 individual identifications of inner coast animals and 2,152 outer coast identifications, we found a really interesting pattern. One being, you can see here, this is that map again, but showing kind of the raw data where animals are seen. The yellow being this inner coast group, and you can see all throughout the Salish Sea, throughout the west coast of Vancouver Island, but you see that black line better. This is that continental shelf break, that 200-meter isobath. And you can see the red being the outer coast group. And what's really interesting, you got to think about this, is that the 3 parameters, as I mentioned initially, being distance from shore, distance from the continental shelf break, and water depth, were the 3 things that we looked at comparisons between individual whales between these 2 subpopulations. And what's interesting is it might seem that there's a north-south differences. So more animals, the inner coast being seen in the Salish Sea, and more outer coast being seen down in Southern California, or Central California down to Southern California. But the real kind of factor here is what we found was the continental shelf break was the primary reason why we see a bit of a difference in where animals are being seen. So for instance, this is a histogram here showing inner coast transient killer whales. Now, I'll walk you through this. So on the x-axis, you have the 0 mark right here. And the 0 mark is that they're right on this black line, on this continental shelf. The negative numbers mean that they're inland or either in coastal waters inland. So you can see here, like up to almost 250 kilometers, 300 kilometers. That's really far in here from the shelf break, the distance. Our geospatial analysis showed distance-wise, we're really far in here. And then anything positive, though, this way, would be seaward of the continental shelf, so further offshore. And as you can see for the inner coast, a lot of the sightings were within coastal waters here. Now, 2 things to take from this. One, that effort is a big issue, being that there's a lot of effort in the Salish Sea, a lot of whale watching, a lot of people that run sighting networks. But the one thing what we did is that we actually took out all the sightings for this area. And similarly, down here in Monterey, you can see Monterey, central coast of California, there's a lot there too as well. So we actually took out all the sightings right here. And what we did was we then compared both again, but just for the outer continental shelf. And the average distance from shore for the inner coast was actually 2.4 kilometers. And the average for the outer coast was around 9 kilometers from the continental shelf. So here's in red, you can kind of see this is similar, it's an overlap. The red being right, there's the 0 mark being right on the continental shelf, seaward. The furthest offshore that we sighted or encountered outer coast animals was 121 kilometers. The furthest for inner coast was 50 kilometers offshore. So they were very statistically significantly different. And this kind of really helped with our social network analysis, where we saw this dichotomy in 2 subpopulations that primarily associated with each other, but occasionally met up. So that's kind of what this map shows and this graph. but they also behaviorally and ecologically differed based on where their habitats were. So, for instance, the intercoast population were primarily close to shore, so they foraged close to the shore. And you can see here, here's an animal, it's T11A. He's hunting near a harbor seal haul out near Protection Island. They typically follow contours of shorelines into bays through narrow inlets, and where they feed on pinnipeds. So with the majority of predation events being on harbor seals. So for both subpopulations, we recorded 204 different predation events. In intercoast animals, 64% of the diet, or 64% of the predation events were on harbor seals, which were followed by harbor porpoise, stellar sea lion, and so on. And this foraging behavior was really kind of first defined by Robin Baird and Larry Dill in the 1980s and 1990s, which was published in 1995, and talks about how these animals really kind of search for prey by using coastal areas close to shore. But the big problem we had was there was no real definition of the outer coast transient killer whale population. So how did they forage? How did they hunt? That was kind of the big question. So if we wanted to make comparisons between how intercoast animals hunt and how outer coast animals hunt, we really needed to come with a baseline. So myself working with Larry Dill, who was actually a co-author and supervisor for Robin Baird in the 90s, him and I teamed up with others, and we developed a foraging behavior study for the outer coast population. And kind of what we found was that these animals forage through these rare observations along the coast. They feed primarily along the shelf break, following the contours of canyons, and they feed on pelagic pinnipeds and small cetaceans. But the real question was we needed more information than just rare observations. So for that, we ended up going to a submarine canyon system off the central coast of California to study a group of these outer coast transients that were seen off of Monterey. And Monterey Bay, California was the perfect area just because it was primarily accessible to us for getting out there to actually observe animals in an offshore kind of open ocean environment. And a lot of the animals, outer coast animals that were seen in other canyon systems along the Pacific coast were animals that were also seen in Monterey. So this kind of enabled us to use this area as kind of a metric. So our team went down in the mid 2000s, and we ended up starting to catalog different individual whales. As you can see here, here's the Monterey Bay Submarine Canyon System. It's the largest submarine canyon on the U.S. West Coast. There's a big canyon that bisects the middle of the bay. It's actually a system of canyons. So you have the major Monterey Canyon, but you also have the Soquel, the Carmel Canyon. And this was an area where we were able to access and look at individuals. So we conducted what are called focal follows. So a focal follow is where you follow a group of animals for greater than 10 to 15 minutes, collecting information on photo identification of individuals, association patterns, diving, synchronization of movements, how they feed. And we're usually within 50 meters of animals. And typically we'd move our vessel in closer when a group of animals were making a predation event so we can identify the prey. Here's our effort for Monterey Bay from 2006 to 2018. And you can see here's the track of our vessel. And this was usually within 50 meters of whales. And from that, we were able to also collect a lot of information. So that was 100 focal follows, 161 sightings from whale watchers. And this turned out to be 323 occurrences. So another goal from the study was to try to look at the seasonal patterns or occurrence of transient killer whales. Here's actually a colleague of mine trying to document a killer whale feeding on a California sea lion, and she was bringing up some tissue. And you can see here's all the sightings for transients in the area between that study. But from that, because we were doing these focal follows within 50 meters, we were able to kind of every 5 minutes we took a GPS recording, and we were able to kind of track the movements of whales. And through these 100 different focal follows, we kind of were able to develop definitions for different behaviors that were very similar as we looked at this in the spatial analysis. One being traveling behavior was very kind of straightforward. They were moving between areas of foraging. Feeding was very stationary. This was actually a feeding event on a gray whale calf. It was very much like in one area there wasn't much movement, but then you can see open water foraging, which was very zigzagging. The animals were kind of out in the open, just kind of moving. But the most interesting result from the study was that transient killer whales actually use the outer coast transient group actually use a very unique foraging behavior called shelf break or canyon foraging. And you can see this animal here, this group here, they kind of follow the contours right along the shelf break, and then they kind of cross over to the other side of canyons to kind of search the edge. And these edges of deep sea canyons actually are areas of upwelling and downwelling where nutrient-rich water gets pushed to the surface, or also brought down into the bottom and transported offshore. And in that area, typically California sea lions, elephant seals forage, and we were able to look at differences in water depth where prey were primarily being hunted. And kind of here's the different prey species. You can see here California sea lion, which was the dominant prey. Actually, you can see in this red diamond, was a lot along the shelf break and just over the slope of the canyon. But you also had northern elephant seals, which were much deeper. So you can see these yellow little triangles here, or diamonds right here, were right over the slope. And gray whale calves down here are another obvious one in the stars. They were kind of spread out, but also in deeper water. So from this, all these sightings, these occurrences. So as I mentioned, we looked at occurrences. So a sighting was any period that a killer whale was reported. But because a group of killer whales could be seen multiple days in a row, we wanted to try to deal with effort bias by looking at maybe how do we define the presence/absence of a group of transient killer whales. To do that, if an animal was seen 5 days in a row, but then wasn't seen the sixth day, that 5 days was one sighting or one occurrence of that group, of that animal or that group of whales. And then if it was not seen the sixth day, the next day after that, and was resighted the next day after that, so the seventh day, that would then be a new occurrence. So we were looking at when the killer whales were present in the bay and at what time of the year. And I'll kind of walk you through this graph here, multiple graphs. You can see the number of occurrences here. And you can see through the winter, there isn't as many whales sighted. But then in the spring, particularly around April, May, and June, we had a spike in sightings. And similar, a big dip again, July, August, but then another smaller peak in September, October. And what we looked at too was what prey might be available based on and what their life cycles were. So 3 dominant prey that were observed mostly were gray whale calves, California sea lions, and northern elephant seals. California sea lions being the #1 prey species, making up 49% of the diet. Gray whale calves being around 20, and elephant seals around 7 to 9%. And their life cycles are quite interesting. So during the spring, gray whale calves are primarily moving north with their mothers as they head up the coast from Mexico into California up to either Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska, into the Bering Sea, depending on what's population. California sea lions, though, also show different movements, especially in the fall. There's a movement of males north from the Channel Islands of Southern California up into the waters of the Salish Sea, as well as off of Washington and Oregon. And then elephant seals have a really complex period where you get females coming into molt in the spring, but you also have a period in the fall where there's what we believe to be young weaners and juveniles that are also coming up to molt. And in the winter, though, you have a period where there is adult males, and it's the breeding period off California for elephant seals. To kind of look at this more, though, we took our data and we also compared it to our colleagues' data on gray whale calf abundance seen throughout 2006 to 2021. And what you can see here is that there's a peak in the number of identified transients throughout those years, particularly in April, May, and June. And you can see here, gray whale calves also peak at that period. And why you don't see gray whale calves past here is because at this point in June and July, gray whale calves are further north of California, and those census work on gray whales are completed. So at this period, there's definitely at least a correlation between these two. between these two species. Predation involved hunts on California sea lions, Pacific white-sided dolphins. These are just some photographs. A minke whale here, and you can see an elephant seal juvenile here as well. So lots of different prey. So from this, we were able to compare at least the differences in prey that were observed for both. The inner coast group was really primarily harbor seals, like I said, over 64%. Similar to like harbor porpoise, so very coastal species, Stellar sea lion. Where the outer coast group are much more focused on prey that were more pelagic or open, so California sea lions, which are known to feed further from shore, especially along the shelf break. Gray whale calves, though, are kind of an oddball. They're actually a coastal species, but because of this particular adaptation to hunting gray whale calves, as they crossed into deep water from shallow water off Monterey Bay, that seems to be a unique situation off of at least Central California. But then throughout the other area, we saw elephant seals and some other dolphin species as well, like common dolphin, things like that. So habitat use. So we decided to try to model this behavior, model this habitat for both. So 90% of intercoast transient killer whales occurred within 5.56 kilometers from shore. And less than 3% were seen further than 10 kilometers from shore. And that includes with the NOAA, extensive NOAA surveys that were offshore. Similar outer coast transients, 90% of all outer coast transients occurred within 20 kilometers of either side of the continental shelf break. And as you can see here, as we modeled this habitat, this is kind of what it looks like. You have the intercoast group here in yellow, again, really kind of close to the shore. This is kind of their habitat. And then you have the outer coast group along the continental shelf break here. And on both sides, 20 kilometers. What was really interesting is this overlap. You can see this yellow and red hash line. This here is where a lot of the sightings of outer coast and inner coast, and there wasn't many. We had about 16 or 17 actual encounters where both groups were together, were sighted, and it was primarily when both habitats converged. So, for instance, a lot of sightings happened right in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And there's a big canyon, the Juan de Fuca Canyon, that kind of comes right in. And this is kind of where we see a lot of the outer coast entering. They typically do not go into further into the Salish Sea, but primarily just in this Juan de Fuca area. And then similar down here off of the southern Oregon coast into California, with the furthest sighting of at least the inner coast group of transients being as far south as Monterey. The outer coast group kind of then takes over as the shelf break really extends close to shore. And this is primarily because the habitat differs. When you look at where harbor seals like to haul out, these very convoluted areas where there's lots of haul out sites, that kind of decreases and disappears as you head south here. Where the outer coast transients similarly don't go into here because they rely really on this open water habitat. From the social network analysis, though, what the most exciting thing we found was evidence potentially for a third population that we believe to be an oceanic group of transient killer whales that occurs further from shore, up to what we believe to be 300-400 kilometers. These animals all had, similar morphologies to transients, so very pointed dorsal fins, solid saddle patches, but some of them had also very thin saddle patches. And they were all seen really far off. So this is, once again, here's the shelf break here in this hash line, the shelf break and slope. But most of these animals were occurring much further from shore than anywhere else. And none of them could be linked in association to either the inner coast or outer coast. And they form their own cluster. You can see here a very narrow saddle patch. And what's really interesting is this. These markings, these elliptical or crescent-shaped markings, are what we believe to be caused by a cookie cutter shark, which is a mesopelagic deep water species, or it's a parasitic shark species that will actually go up to large vertebrates, tuna, other sharks, whales, and they take off these nasty bite wounds. And they have these razor sharp teeth. They'll go up and rasp a hole. But they're only found, what's really interesting is that these sharks are only really found in deep pelagic offshore waters, kind of providing some evidence that at least these transients are making some open ocean movements. So in conclusion, This analysis really shows that the West Coast transient killer whale population forms at least two distinct groups that are socially as well as spatially distinct in the California current system. Both populations show distinctive differences in behavioral ecology that is adapted to specific habitats, as well as the study highlights a potential third population that frequents oceanic waters beyond the continental shelf. And finally, this provides a foundation for further studies, as well as more data that can be used for stock assessments. And I'm happy to say right now that this has been submitted for publication, and we're excited to hopefully have this come out very soon. Acknowledgements. There's a lot of people that were involved in this research, including my supervisory committee, Dr. Andrew Trites, Lawrence Dill, and Dr. Marie-Audrey Mathieson. We had a lot of support from NOAA, a number of researchers from NOAA, as well as the Oregon State University, who we continue to work with, as well as Pacific Wildlife Foundation and other research support like Access, which is a great group of researchers that are working off the central coast of California, and a number of whale watchers. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone, and I appreciate you having me on this call.
Josh, that was quite the presentation, quite the number of people that have collaborated with you on this research, this study. Thank you for all of that information. Again, I'm Leanne Lindsay, host today of the 6th Annual Ocean Life Symposium, and with us as well, whale experts and seal experts from the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study, Scott and Tree Mercer, who founded this symposium and have been doing so much great work along the Mendocino-Sonoma coast as well as the East Coast. So I'm going to invite both of you to come in and talk with Josh a little bit about his presentation.
Yeah, it was wonderful, Josh. And an orca expert, I am not. We've seen a handful off the Point Arena Peninsula out here, and I spent over 20 years on the East Coast in the Gulf of Maine, up to 165 days a year. Never saw an orca. And a man who was writing a book on orcas kept coming out on my boat asking me questions. And he actually won an award for the book, but I said, I can't help you. We just don't see them. And he caught on after about 8 trips with me, and he kept coming out hoping to see an orca. He wrote Orcas of the Gulf, if you ever run across that book. It's a great book, but he didn't have any firsthand sightings. Well, one thing I've been wondering, and we hear a lot of wild estimates of percentages of gray whale calves that orcas take. I've heard everywhere from 30 to as many as 80%. Do you have any idea? I'm not going to pin you down just because we hear such wild numbers. I'm wondering.
Yeah, so from our analysis, 20% of the observations were gray whale calves. And likely it's a lot higher depending on the population. So what's really interesting is that the outer coast group are kind of, at least part of the year, and spatially in Monterey is kind of where they hunt gray whale calves. And then there's another population, at least in the Gulf of Alaska up and towards the Aleutian Islands, that also hunt gray whale calves that are different from the ones in Monterey. So it likely is anywhere between 20 to 30. I can see 20 to 30% being a good estimate, but that's really hard to say. We're also kind of diving into, I'm collaborating with Oregon State University, and we're working on a paper now. And what we found is the intercoast grouping, which, most people see in the Salish Sea, Puget Sound, as I mentioned, hunt harbor seals. But in Oregon waters, we've had a number of successful predations by them on gray whale calves off Oregon. So that's a bit of an eye opener, because a lot of these animals really don't focus on gray whales or have ever been seen hunting gray whales. So that was kind of a big one, and we're drafting a manuscript for that right now. And that was, so it all depends. I think if you were to take all the observed predation events that have been recorded, plus all the strandings of gray whales that are presumed to have been killed by killer whales, and then you came up with an estimate that way, that I think would be potentially around 20 to 30%.
Okay, thanks. That's a more realistic estimate than I've heard. When we do see orcas off of Point Arena Peninsula, it's another question I wanted to ask you is, it's always, I think almost not every time, but almost every time when we have orcas come through, they come through like NASCAR, a lot of splashing and this and that. And usually gray whales are northbound. most of the sightings we've had. And they don't react at all that we can tell unless their blood pressure goes up. But there's just no reaction at all. And I'm wondering what if that's normal, or how do they know? Is there certain calls that the orcas make that would make them more nervous or want to speed up, or anything you can add to that?
Yeah, honestly, it could depend on the population of transients. I think we also are colleagues in Oregon. When our data on transients we shared with our colleagues at Oregon State University also focus on gray whales. And when they're off the Oregon coast, they even found that the gray whales don't seem to show any sort of reaction to transients. And it could be that some of the transient killer whales that are present aren't really specializing in hunting gray whales. There's harbor seals available. It also could be that that where the gray whales are situated. So if they're really close to the shore, they may feel more confident that they're not going to get attacked because they kind of got the upper hand of being in shallow water, where transients it's much more dangerous for them to hunt. I think it all depends on the state of the animal too as well. So in Monterey, the gray whales don't, or when they cross that canyon, they're sitting ducks. It's very deep water, and those outer coast transients really know how to hunt in there. But along the coast, we've seen transients abandon hunts because it becomes too close. But we did have a really cool sighting off in Northern California, off Eureka, actually, of a group of intercoast animals with one outer coast animal, which was really, really odd. And they actually successfully, they killed the animal but didn't feed on it, and the gray whale actually washed ashore, and that was last year. That was a very interesting sighting.
No, Josh, why would they not feed upon it after going through expending the energy and was that a practice session for maybe the young ones in the group?
Yeah, so for that particular situation, I think it was more of I forgot to mention, it was more of a situational instance where the animal actually kind of went towards shore. It basically swam really quick towards the shore and died. And basically, killer whales was too dangerous for them to try to get it. But I did have a really cool encounter that was sent to me from NOAA off the outer coast of Washington, where it was a drone footage of these killer whales. Actually, the gray whale carcass, they had killed it, and the carcass was actually drifting inshore, and the killer whales were going up and grabbing the flukes and humping their and basically trying to push the carcass further offshore to feed on it. So that was really interesting, an interesting behavior that was kind of new to us that we've never seen before. So it's very variable.
That's clever of them for sure, and I know how well skilled they are at that. Josh, I had a question about the newer population, the oceanic. Will there eventually be genetic analysis to you mentioned the saddle patches, and I know that is a genetic trait. So will genetics help you to understand the population even better?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So that's kind of a goal. I'm actually 2 days away from flying to California. I'm going on a NOAA ship for 20 days off the central coast of California. We're hopefully trying to look for these animals. I get a pretty regular reports from them right now. NOAA's Southwest Fisheries is actually on a survey, and that's something we talked about, is getting more biopsy samples to do genetics. Right now, there's been about 6 sightings on the cruises that have been happening. Most of them have been all outer coast transients that we know who they are. But these oceanic animals, they do occur at least once every survey, and unfortunately, until recently, when we started our catalog work, it wasn't really of interest that much to NOAA to really try to get that data. But now we kind of came up with this, like, this is an interesting group of animals. And Phil Moran, who's the lead geneticist, is very interested in trying to piece together if these are a separate population as well. So that's kind of the goal now, is to try to get the genetics, because you're likely right. There's most likely a different type of genetics or a different haplotype or something going on with some of these animals.
Yeah, I would think so. That's really fascinating. I mean, this is just very exciting news. Thank you for that.
I'm curious too, as you brought up a couple of terms I'd like you to talk to a little bit more, and that's both social and geospatial.
So social being the association pattern. So if we were all out for coffee, we'd be socializing. So that's kind of one of the terms that we use in social analyses, that we're analyzing who's hanging out with who, the strength of that relationship. So if, for instance, if Scott, you were hanging out with our host Lee, and you guys over and over and over and over and over again, that'd be a strong association. Where Scott, you and I have never hung out. There's very little association there. I live in British Columbia, you live in California. There's not that much association. We might be part of two different populations. I'm part of the Canadian population, you're part of the American population. But that doesn't mean that they're genetically distinct populations. What we're kind of going with is that they're likely subpopulations. So a genetically distinct population being that they never associate, they're genetically distinct, they're either separated somehow from, say, the Atlantic from the Pacific. But a subpopulation is usually a term given to animals that show differences in habitat and behavior. So they either don't spend a lot of time together, they're in different habitats. That can kind of be a subpopulation or a demographically distinct population. Now, geospatial analyses, a geospatial just means location or habitat. So what we're really looking at is where animals are spending their time and why they're spending their time in that area. So for instance, are they spending their time off the continental shelf break because that habitat is really unique? It's got a lot of upwelling. It's same with the coastal areas where there's a lot of harbor seal, a lot of habitat complexity, there's a lot of haul out sites. That would be kind of the analysis we would run, would be that geospatial analysis. We're looking at why those animals are in that area based on the water depth or the distance from the shore or whatnot.
Thank you for that clarification. And if you're just tuning in, you're listening to the voice of Dr. Josh McInnes. He's with the Marine Mammal Research Unit at the University of British Columbia. He is also a research coordinator at Maine Life Studies in Monterey Bay, California. And that's where he focuses on studying toothed cetaceans. So I wanted to ask you about that. And then I want to get back to Scott and Tree Mercer, the Monterey Whale and Seal Study, who helped found the 6th annual Ocean Life Symposium. Actually, this is the 6th version of that symposium that they founded. But what is that toothed cetaceans? What focus do you have on that?
So I'm other than killer whales, I'm really interested in Risso's dolphins, which are another species of dolphin off the central coast of California. I think they're fascinating. I am very fascinated by beaked whales, sperm whales. So understanding similar things like the social behavior, the foraging, is also very important for a lot of these other species. And Risso's dolphins are kind of my other species I would like to spend more time studying. Hopefully I will soon, especially because killer whales it's taken up a big chunk of my life. I'd like to definitely dedicate some time to these other species. So that's kind of where I look at toothed cetaceans being a species of dolphin or whale that have teeth and not baleen like the blue whales or humpbacks.
Thank you. And Scott and Tree, want to have you comment here, but I do want to first let our listeners know also coming up, we have on this mini hour of this symposium, we got several more hours to go, but just coming up next is Howie Garrett, and he's the president of the board of directors for the Orca Network up in Washington State. And then after that, we're going to make our way down the coast, and we'll be talking with Richard Charter, who's a senior fellow of the Ocean Foundation. He's works out of Washington, D.C., but he lives in Bodega Bay down here on the Sonoma coast. And then we have Michael Stocker in Marin at the Ocean Conservation Research. And then in Minneapolis, we've got young Ian Bashir of the Ian Foundation. So that's coming up on the Ocean Life Symposium. And this is KGUA in Molalla 88.3 FM. And now back to you, Scott and Tree Mercer of the Monterey Whale and Seal Study.
Yeah, Josh, excuse me. I should have mentioned that we've never seen orcas and when mothers and calves are going by at the same time. That's just timing, but I didn't mention that when we've only seen orcas in the area when at the same time that we have adult grays going by at the same time. So I don't know if that would make a difference in the excitement of the orcas, or if they're already filled up on pinnipeds. You really opened my eyes with that graph you had with, harbor porpoise. Harbor seals. Tough time to be a seal. And I was surprised too at how many porpoise it seems that they get. So
Yeah, it's I think with your area, so a lot of people go, well, why aren't we seeing killer whales close to shore anywhere other than Monterey? And I get that a lot of people living up and down the California coast. And the big question, I think, is that they're out there, but they're too far to see. As you head north, that shelf break, as I mentioned, widens. And it's likely that at least the outer coast group that we see primarily in Monterey and elsewhere are being seen or encountered at least further offshore, that shelf break area, making it difficult unless you're out there to find them. And where the animals you might be seeing where you are could be either southern residents coming south. That's also one option, but also could be intercoast transients that also make their way down. We do have reports of some intercoast groups. We've identified 63 different intercoast whales, at least as far south as Monterey. So it could be some of those animals too.
Okay, we've upgraded our camera equipment, so hopefully we can contribute some to you as well.
I'll appreciate it.
Yeah, we see so few of them, but we'll be ready. By upgrading, I mean stronger lens. Rissos we do see a lot of here, kind of seasonally, but when we have them around. And Leilani Stell, Dr. Leilani Stell, I figured you were familiar with her, at the University of Redlands. She's been running a project with students for a number of years. So I didn't know if you knew that, or were aware of that, if that could help you at all with, they're doing identification with that.
Yeah, she's amazing. Her and I've had some really great conversations. Actually, she came out with me one time when we were looking at Rissos in Monterey. And the Rissos were not, there's not, when it comes to photo identification, it's a bit daunting. There's a lot of Rissos, but our catalog's mostly Monterey and a bit further north, and there appears to be a bit of a difference, at least in animals that are seen further south in her region, in Southern California. So we have talked about comparing, actually, which is really cool. I hope we can I can sit down. We did talk about that. The reason why we haven't yet is because I've been swamped with killer whale stuff. There's been no time to even get to it. But I've got a hard drive full of dolphin photos that I need to go through. But so yeah, I'd love to sit down with her.
Wonderful.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, I encourage you to do those Rissos. They're just the most fascinating animals. And we one day watched them, Josh. They came from the north and they passed us going south. Several hours later, they started to come back again. We were still out there searching for gray whales, and we got to see them going in both directions.
Oh, that's so cool. We a lot of people think that they are primarily nocturnal hunters because they eat squid. But we found interesting behavior where they, in the middle of the day, we've seen it multiple times where they do this high speed swimming along the shelf break in Monterey, and they chase squid. And what we found is that we were following them from behind, and there was squid being kicked up in their wake. So we were picking up little tiny opalescent or market squid. And we were like, wow, they're definitely feeding on something. And another colleague of mine he's a tuna fisherman, and he was working offshore, and he said he was with some Rissos, and these Rissos were feeding on another kind of squid, and he collected the squid for us. And we're not sure what it is yet. Once again, it's in a jar sitting at my office. But we'll hopefully know a little bit more about what those were too.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for joining us today. That's Josh McInnes. He's with the Marine Mammal Research Unit at the British Columbia University, and he's also a research coordinator at the Marine Life Studies in Monterey Bay, California. And we are at the 10 o'clock hour. We are going to continue on this special day of the Ocean Life Symposium. This is the 6th year that the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Studies, Scott and Tree Mercer, have been doing this. 5 years with me. I'm Leanne Lindsay. Thanks for listening to the Resilient Earth podcast, where we talk about critical issues and positive actions for our planet. Resilient Earth is produced by Planet Centric Media, a 501c3 nonprofit, and Seastorm Studios, Inc., located on the rugged North Sonoma coast of Northern California. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with co-hosts and co-producers Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendocino Whale and Seal Study, located on the South Mendocino and North Sonoma coasts. The music for this podcast is by Eric Alleman, an international composer, pianist, and writer living in the Sea Ridge. Discover more of his music, animations, ballet, stage, and film work at ericalleman.com. You can find Resilient Earth on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, SoundCloud, and wherever you find your podcasts. Please support us by subscribing or donating to our cause.